Welcome to the first coding challenge of this section. And as you can imagine, this one is going to be all about functions. And we're back to the two gymnastic teams from the previous section, the dolphins and the koalas. And now there is a new gymnastics discipline which works in a bit different way. So now in this new discipline, each team competes 3 times, and then the average of the 3 scores is calculated. So each team will get 1 average score. And then a team only wins if it has at least double the average score of the other team. And otherwise, no team wins. So sounds pretty simple, I hope. And let's take a look at your tasks now. So first, create an arrow function called calcAverage, which calculates the average of 3 scores. And actually, this calcAverage function should be able to calculate the average of any 3 values. So of course, the values don't have to be scores. Any random numbers will work just the same. So this is basically a generic function just to calculate the average of 3 values. Then use that function to calculate the average for both teams. And again, down here, you have the test data that you can use. Create a function called checkWinner, which takes the average score of each team as parameters. And these parameters should be called average dolphins here and average koalas. And then, based on these 2 average scores, the function will log the winner to the console together with the victory points. And that, of course, needs to happen according to the rule that I just explained before. So a team only wins if it has at least double the average score of the other team. And otherwise, no team wins. So you need to check for that condition in order to print which team wins. And in some cases, no team might win at all. So you need to account for that as well. So here in point 3, you write the checkWinner function. And then in number 4, you will use, so basically you will call the checkWinner function in order to determine the winner for both the test data 1 and test data 2. Okay, so I have some hints again, but if you want to try it on your own without the hints, then just pause the video right now. But if you need the hints, then, well, here they go. So this one is probably pretty obvious, which is to calculate the average of 3 values, add them all together, and divide by 3. But the second one here is a little bit more important and maybe more difficult for you to figure out on your own. So to check if number A is at least double number B, what you need to check is if A is greater or equal 2 times B. Okay, and so this is what you will use with the team's average scores. Okay, so it's important to keep this one in mind because of this rule that the team only wins when it has double the average score of the other team. All right. Now, please make really sure that you understood everything I showed you about functions before you attempt this challenge, because this one is not so straightforward. And so I don't want you to get frustrated. So again, please really make sure you understand functions and only then attempt to do this challenge. But if you feel that you're ready, then just pause the video now and good luck with this challenge. All right, so let me show you my solution to this challenge, which I hope, of course, you were able to do on your own. So I'm going to start with the calcAverage function, as in number 1. And remember that this should be an arrow function, and it will receive 3 values so that it can calculate the average of these 3 numbers. And here I'm actually just going to call the 3 numbers A, B, and C, because again, this is supposed to be just a generic function which can calculate averages of any 3 numbers. It doesn't have to be any scores. And so ABC are just generic variable names. But of course, it's totally okay if you used more specific variable names. So adding all the 3 numbers together and then dividing by 3. So this one is nothing new. this was just to basically test your knowledge of the syntax of the arrow function. So what's important to notice here is that we need the parentheses here because we have multiple parameters, but then here we only really have this line of code. And so therefore, we don't need to even write the return. This value gets automatically returned from the function. And now let's just test it out before we move any further. So calc average, and then let's just use some random numbers because here we know that this is supposed to be 4, right? So we have 3, 4, 5, and so the middle one here is the average between these 3. And indeed, it is. And so we know that our function works. And so we can move on to point number 2, which is to use the function to calculate the average for both teams. So let's say score Dolphins is equal to calc average. And now we pass in the specific arguments for the 3 parameters A, B, and C. And so for test data 1, which is this, so let me actually write that here, test 1. So for the Dolphins, we pass in the values 44, 23, and 71. Then for the koalas, it works the same way. So score koalas equals calc average. And now we have 65, 54, and 49. So nice reusable function right here. And so having this function, we don't need to calculate it here manually every single time. So that's really great. So we can really appreciate the fact that, again, a function is really like a machine in some sense. So it doesn't care where the inputs come from and where they go. All it does is to calculate the average of 3 numbers, no matter if it's scores or heights of people or money or whatever it is. So this function really is kind of isolated from the rest of the code here. It's a standalone function that we can then use for our own purposes. And that might sound pretty obvious, but it's actually important that you really internalize this aspect of functions. Only then can you really start to see the potential for functions everywhere in your code. Anyway, with that being said, let's now log these values to the console, because I always like to see what I'm doing. So this part is of course not mandatory, but it's also nice to be able to know these scores so that we know if the logic that we're going to implement next is working correctly. So we see that in this case, the koalas have a score that is higher than the one of the dolphins, but it's not double. And so we already know that in this case, no team should be able to win. But let's now actually implement that functionality. So that's the function check winner. And so it takes the average dolphins and average koalas parameters, okay, and then it logs the winner to the console. So let's do that. And once more, it's no problem if you did this differently. If you made it work, then it's great. So average dolphins and average koalas. And now all we need to do is to check whether the dolphins won or the koalas won, or if no one won, basically. So when do the dolphins win? Well, they win if they have double the points of the koalas, right? That's the condition. So again, a team only wins if it has at least double the average score of the other team. And so that's why I told you here in this hint that this is how we check for that. So A has double the amount of points of B if A is greater than 2 times B. So let's do that. So average dolphins greater or equal to 2 times the average koalas. And in this case, we log to the console Dolphins win the trophy. So let's use an emoji here again. But you don't need, of course, to do that. So it's already here. And now it also told us to put the points. So, for example, 30 versus 13. So both points with the verses in between. So that's average dolphins versus average koalas. So you see that here we are also practicing all the other skills that we already acquired before, especially in the previous section, right? Okay, and now here we just need to do the opposite. So else if, and now if the koalas have at least, so that's basically what this one here means. So greater equal is basically at least. So if average koalas have at least double the points of the dolphins, then the koalas win. So let's just grab this one from here. Koalas, and here it's average koalas and then average dolphins. Average, yes. All right. And now in any other case, we say that no one wins. So I think that's also said in the rules. Yeah, that's number 5. I think I even forgot to tell you this one, but hopefully you read it. So you should ignore draws in this exercise this time. So if none of these is true, we simply say that no team wins. No team wins. Okay, and now all we need to do is to call this function here. So check winner, and we will do that with score dolphins and score koalas. Okay, so let's recap. We calculated the score of the dolphins up here and of the koalas as well. And now we call the check winner function here, okay? And we use as arguments the scores that we calculated before. And then score dolphins will become average dolphins here in this function, because that's the name of the parameter. And I see that I misspelled this. And so now I can use that Command D that I talked to you about before. So I can select all of them. So Command D, Command D, Command D, Command D. And now I can use all of these cursors here at the same time. So dolphins. You see, I inserted the P in all of the variable names everywhere. All right. And so now this parameter name here gets used for all these calculations. And again, originally this value comes basically from here, from calculating the average of these 3 scores. So this average gets stored here, then we use it here, and then it gets basically transferred to average dolphins and is then used everywhere in this function. Okay, so let's now test. And as we expected, no team wins, because this team here, even though it has more than the dolphins, it's not double. And so therefore, they do not win. Now, of course, what is also important to mention here is that this check winner function here is also completely independent of these score values that we calculated earlier. So here we can simply call this function with completely different values. So the function doesn't care where these values come from. So where average dolphins and average koalas come from. It's a standalone function and it doesn't care at all where these values came from. We can just plug in some random numbers here and then call it. And let's use a smaller number here. Okay, so just so that the average dolphin here is actually more than double of the average koalas. So if we run this now, then we see that the dolphins win with 576 versus 111. And so that's exactly the numbers that we plugged in here. Okay, so once more, it's important to keep in mind that these functions are all independent from another. We just happen to call checkWinner here with these values that we calculated before. But it's not mandatory to do that. Any other values will work just as well. And so we proved that here. Anyway, now let's use test data 2. And actually what I'm going to do is to reassign these two scores here. So we calculate them first, then we call checkWinner, and then I'm going to recalculate them and call checkWinner again. So what I mean by saying that is that these need to be let variables so that we can reassign them. Remember that? Const values cannot be mutated. They cannot be changed. And so they need to be let. And then here, of course, we need to get rid of that let because we do not want to create new variables. We just want to overwrite. So we want to reassign the values that we had earlier. So this time the values are 85, 54, and 41. 85, 54, and 41, and I hope that's correct. And then for the koalas, we have 23, 34, and 27. So that's 23, 34, and 27. Let's log these actually also, and then simply call checkWinner again. And now with the new values of score dolphins and score koalas that we just reassigned. Okay, so let's see. And now the dolphins have an average score of 60 and the koalas of 28. And so now the dolphins win with 60 versus 28. So that's a close call. So if the koalas had 3 more points, then no one would win. But the dolphins managed to do it. Great. So I hope that this all made sense to you. And I know it is probably still a bit confusing at this point. And if you did some things differently, well then, once more, that is completely okay. It just means you're developing your own coding style over time. For example, here with the average scores, of course, you could have created new variables down here for the test data too. So that's just one of many things that you could have done differently, which are perfectly fine. As long as your results are the same, you're good to go. So take some time and review this lecture. Remember that you can check out my final code also in the final folder in the GitHub repo. And then you're ready to move on to our next big topic in this section, which is going to be arrays. So I hope to see you there soon.